welcome back again, folks. It's Leon with the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast, and we have Matt along today, and we also have Barbara Casey from Small Ruminant Consulting back with us again, and we just want to cover the subject of Coccidiostat. We had a question or two come in for the podcast, and we asked Barbie to come in and share with us on that. So welcome back again, Barbie. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
So what can you tell us about Coccidiostats? Can we hear a discussion on what to feed, when to feed, and then we have like at least 3 different choices we can pick from in the sheep and goat end of things?
Absolutely. So first thing to note is that we're focusing on a parasite that is basically invisible to the human eye. So we're looking at coccidiosis caused by a parasite called Coccidia. And typically the animal naturally has Coccidia present in their system. When it becomes a problem is when we get an overload of that parasite in certain conditions. Usually it's in springtime or whenever we have some wet weather. So when there are wet conditions, we see outbreaks of Coccidia that cause problems. One way to help with that is by feeding a Coccidiostat. And I will say Coccidiostats are great, but they do not make up for management decisions. So they're a preventative. They do not control an outbreak situation. And they don't control a situation where management hasn't taken care of wet conditions. That may be pasture, that may be just not being able to clean out the barn because the weather's crazy, that kind of thing. So there are a couple things that we can use in the feed. There are 3 different items. One is called decoquinate, often referred to as decox. Another one is called rumensin. The active ingredient in that is monensin. And the third one is bobatec. Now, it's important to note that rumensin cannot be used in sheep, but it can be used in goats. Bobatec is not labeled for goats, but is labeled for sheep. And these really come down to regulatory situations and just labeling. I will also state I am not a vet. I'm a nutritionist, so I work with this on the feed side. But it's important to remember that all 3 of these coccidiostats for the feed hit the parasite at different times in their life cycle. So if you were to be feeding one in a grain mix and switch over to another, you may have an outbreak or a small outbreak because we're hitting different stages in the life cycle. So that's something to keep in mind if you do switch from one to the other.
So before we get into that more, how you made the point of mentioning that you're not a vet. How are these coccidiostats labeled? Do you need a veterinary prescription? My take is not, but I've always kind of run into that with questions with the feed mill a little bit. Do you know much about how that's obviously you got to follow the label, but there's no VDF required or anything like that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So these are considered, they're a different class of antibiotics that do not have a withdrawal time, and they're only used for coccidiosis prevention. Rumensin and bobatec are also used for feed efficiency improvement. But basically none of them have a withdrawal time in terms of meat. Therefore, they don't require a veterinary prescription or a VFD. So they can be added to feeds at any time. We just have to follow the guidelines that were given so that we're within correct parameters and levels.
Yeah, sounds good.
Are they technically really even an antibiotic?
It's a different class of antibiotics, and most often it's not referred to as an antibiotic, no, because it's not treating an infection.
Right.
But if you were to be feeding for an antibiotic-free program, you probably would not be allowed to use them. Depends on the program maybe, but technically.
Matt, you are absolutely correct. It depends on the program. Majority of the programs will allow a coccidiostat because it's a totally different class that is not typically used in human medicine.
Sure.
Yeah. So can we look at a little bit some more about when or how to decide which one to feed?
Absolutely. So, first thing is we're going to pick which species. If we have goats, you're going to choose between decox and rumensin. And if you have sheep, you're going to choose between decox and bobatec. So that's the first thing to look at. Second thing to look at is, do you want to feed it all the time? This will come down to your management and your program, how you have your animals grouped, whether you have them grouped by age or not. I will say there is some industry preconceptions that decox tends to work better on coccidiosis situations than the other two. Research has not proven either way. I've seen research going both ways, and there's not really one over the other that I can say works better. However, there are some situations where it does work better in different areas, different regions. Decox might work better than the other two. So you really have to find what works on your farm. But I will say, I prefer that all of my customers put something in their diet at least for the first 6 months of life, especially before they're 3 months old.
Yeah.
And that's because those animals are so susceptible to getting gut lining damage by coccidia. And once it's damaged and they go through, a coccidiosis outbreak, they don't always bounce back as well in terms of feed efficiency, in terms of fighting off other parasites. Often, if they have a coccidiosis outbreak, they may have another parasite as well, or it lowers their immune system and makes them more susceptible to other parasites and just overall other bugs, whether it be respiratory or foot issues or anything like that, because they're taking advantage of the lowered immune system. So when I put together diets for young animals, particularly creep, I will put creep feeds, usually using decox to start with, or if they're sheep, I'll use bobatec. But the reason is rumensin tends to have a little bit of an odd taste. And so sometimes the young goats won't start to eat as quickly on a product with rumensin in it as they would decox. Okay. Sheep, it doesn't matter. You can use decox or bobatec at a young age. But definitely, I feel it's absolutely important to put those in there as long as you can. Obviously, if we're on an organic program, you won't be able to use any of these, most likely, unless there's some loophole in your organic certification that says you can use them.
So do you see any benefit to running a coccidiostat in the ewes ration prior to lambing?
So I will say, as the animals get older, especially over 1 year, they really don't have a need for a coccidiostat on a regular basis because their immune system is able to typically fight off coccidia readily. And So rarely do we see coccidia outbreaks in mature animals. However, you mentioned pre-lambing or pre-kidding. I do like to see that a little bit, putting some of those coccidiostats in there in that late gestation, early lactation diet, only because I think it helps control the population that the lambs then, or the kids, whether we feed them on the ground or not, they're going to pick at hay or straw or shavings, whatever's on the ground. They're curious. And so they're going to pick at that. They may get some coccidia or other parasites just because mom's immune system has been lower, and maybe the elevated levels, mom can handle it, but those babies can't. So I do encourage that if you can.
Mm-hmm. Is there any danger to the coccidiosis building up immunity to these products? If I've had producers that were feeding it basically year round to their ewe or dove flock, just kind of because it was in their feed and they were supplementing year round. Is there any danger to that, to building up immunity to these products?
So I have not seen any solid evidence that is a problem. I will say, some of these drugs per se work better in some areas than others. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's showing some resistance. There is no science or solid research or anything that I've seen that has proven that to this point. Yep. Now, I will say, when we start talking about treatment of coccidiosis beyond the preventative level in the feed, we start talking about treating with drugs like Improlium. You might also hear it called Corid or Corid, or using sulfa drugs. Sulfa drugs are not over the counter anymore and require a vet prescription. The Corid product, we do have to watch a little bit and make sure that it is effective. So some regions of the US are showing some resistance to that product and therefore have to use sulfa drugs or something different. All of that is where we have to refer to our vet. Yeah. But on the nutrition side, though, I will say, if you are giving an Improlium product, I do suggest also giving vitamin B. It's easy to find your vitamin B shots. What happens is the Improlium ties up thiamine, which is a precursor to vitamin B. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we have issues when we're drenching them 5 days in a row. We might see some vitamin B tied up to the point where we end up with polio issues. And you would know that because the animals would start going in circles. They would look like they're blind, acting like they're blind, just wandering around aimlessly. So that can easily be treated with vitamin B. But it is now common practice that when you give Corid, that you go ahead and give a vitamin B injection. Your vet may suggest giving more than one. That's something I would say consult your veterinarian on, though.
Sure. Have you found the Corid to be effective?
I have on my farm.
Okay.
I have had other farms that have said it's not working. We've got to do something different. Yeah. And that I do think has been because they have used it over time. They have used it so many years in a row to treat. Maybe they have a wet season typically in the spring and it's always an issue. Just the atmosphere is wet. Maybe they don't use a coccidiostat in the feed And some folks just have common practice that at a certain time they give Corid. I prefer not to do that. I prefer to use it only when needed. And I think most veterinarians would tell you that. But there are a couple different ways to give that product. One is in the drinking water. The other is in a drench form. Typically it's over 5 days. And I think misuse of the product in the past is what's caused some of the resistance, whether it be just drenching for 1 day when it's instructed to be drenched 5 days in a row, or maybe we didn't dilute it correctly when we put it in the water.
Sure.
And the challenge with putting it in the water becomes we have to make sure those animals are drinking it and it is clean and not interacting with, maybe you have a high sulfate water, maybe you have high iron water. Some of those things can also tie up different components. It can also cause an issue with it staying in suspension. So there are a lot of issues there that I think has led to some resistance across the country.
Okay. Yeah. Because we haven't found Corid to be very effective for us. But the sulfur products work great. But like you said, you have to work with your vet on that.
Yeah. Yep. And unfortunately, because sulfur products are used so much in human medicine, we definitely have to work closely with our vets on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think where we struggle with it from time to time is in our winter lambing group, where we're in the barn, all the conditions you listed, you're in a tight barn. It's hard to keep it clean enough. And it's usually in lambs that aren't consuming a lot of creep feed yet. So they're not getting the Coccidiostat. I think that's where treating the ewes has certainly helped us prior to lambing. But I think that's our biggest challenge with it, really our only challenge. Once we get those lambs weaned and on feed with a Coccidiostat in there, we don't really have much problems with it.
I would agree, Matt, and I would say that's the most common situation across the U.S.
Now the challenge there is if you have lambs that are on the ewes, your only treatment option you're left with is drenching them every day for 5 days, because they're not drinking enough of water to do it that way. They're not consuming enough of creep, or obviously once they've had it. So yeah, your only option is drenching them, and that's a pain.
It is.
So preventive is truly the key to that.
Yes, it becomes very cumbersome when you have over 10 lambs, basically.
Yeah.
So from on the sheep side of things, how does a shepherd pick between Bovatec and Decox? So my understanding is I get the question sometimes, well, my lambs are, doing this and this, and we talk about it. And, again, I'm not a veterinarian either, but their symptoms would point toward coccidia. And they say, okay, we'll put Decox in the feed. Well, that doesn't fix the problem.
No, it doesn't.
It's only a preventative. It keeps the coccidia, keeps them from reproducing, right?
It's going to keep them at a lower level and keep that level in check, essentially.
Yeah. It would still be a good management practice if you have the problem to put it in your feed to prevent future outbreaks.
Correct.
But you would still have to treat the current outbreak.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And so the decision is going to be the same on the goats as it would be the sheep, whether you're choosing Rumensin for goats or Bovatec for sheep versus Decox. Decox is a Coccidiostat only, and it's also more expensive. So honestly, it really usually comes down to economics. But if you have a grass-based program, you're probably not going to get the feed efficiency benefits out of the Rumensin and Bovatec that you would if you had a grain-based program. Or even half and half. The more grain you have, the more feed efficiency benefits you're going to see from the Rumensin or the Bovatec. So that's something to consider. The other thing is we need to take a look at breeding times as well. You may have heard that Rumensin is also used to help prevent or control outbreaks on abortions. Mm-hmm. So that is the one situation where Rumensin can be written as a VFD from your vet for sheep feeds. It also works in goats the same way, but in certain outbreaks, we can use these ingredients and they will certainly help. That's a whole nother topic for another day on abortions and best addressed by a veterinarian. But I will say, Rumensin does have some effect on that. The other two do not in late gestation.
Is there anything? So my vet was saying that in dairy cows, Rumensin helps the cows milk better, and she thought that would translate to, well, in my case, sheep. So I wasn't aware that it's not labeled for sheep, because the way she had made it sound is she would actually recommend it. But I'll have to get back to her on that. Is there anything to Rumensin perhaps helping the does milk better?
Absolutely.
Have you heard that? Okay.
There is. The challenge is I don't believe it's labeled for lactating does.
Gotcha.
So the reason she might say that is because it increases feed efficiency. And that's what it comes down to. So you can feed less feed and get better gains in meat, or get more milk out of the same amount of feed by using something like Rumensin or Bovatec. It alters the dynamics within the rumen and therefore makes it more, you can use less feeding and get the same or better results. Again, Rumensin isn't necessarily approved for lactating does. Therefore, dairy sheep or dairy goats, you are not going to see those items in their feed because it's got a label restriction. Those are legal restrictions that are controlled by the government. They may be different in other countries.
So that was one of the questions that came in. The question was about using Rumensin in lactating does. So basically, if this was a flock of meat goats, they could or they couldn't use Rumensin?
I cannot tell you that we can. However, I know many, many folks that do.
Yeah. So it's
not a milk. You're not selling the milk. That would definitely be a big difference.
Yeah, the reason those labels have not been approved is because the research isn't there.
Yeah.
And until the research is there, they're not going to change the labels.
What about Bovatec for lactating animals? Same as Rumensin?
I have not looked closely at that label to tell you yes or no on that. But again, it would be the same situation. I don't know of any farms that actually feed, I'll say dairy farms that feed an ionophore, which is a Coccidiostat is an ionophore that also does improves feed efficiency. So Bovatec or Rumensin. I have not seen any farms that actually feed it during lactation that are dairies for human consumption.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to make any comments on this big question of rumensin and being bad for goats that keeps floating around?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'll tell you, every few years, nutritionists and veterinarians get this question, and people get really scared of various things. In the last year, the hot topic has been rumensin. I will say too much of a good thing can always be bad. And as always, there are incidences where there are errors in feed manufacturing that cause issues. I really believe that that is where this discussion has stemmed from, is an error from a feed manufacturer that caused an issue at one farm. Maybe it's a big farm, maybe they know a lot of people, but word has spread quickly. 98% of the time, there are no issues. And keep in mind that rumensin has been around. I mean, it has been around for a very, very, very long time. I cannot imagine that all of a sudden in the last 2 years, there is this new development that is causing goats to die from feeding rumensin that hasn't happened in the past.
It seems like you were saying, it's kind of a rumor that goes around, and like somebody asked me, so I asked the next person, and it just seems to go around, and I asked my vet that question because I'd gotten it, and she was like, "Oh no, not this again." She said every couple years she gets like a lot of questions about feeding rumensin, because the rumor gets started, and off we go to the rumor mill. So
yeah, and I will tell you, I have talked with several vets, and they have had the exact same response.
it's fine.
The other thing, though, I will say the feed industry has done a good job of responding to what the consumer or customer wants. There are several feeds out there that they have now transitioned to non-medicated or made them available as non-medicated. And if you want medication added at your feed mill outside of a show feed that's purchased in a bag, you can have it added at the feed mill.
Sure.
I will put a little caveat there. When I'm working with feed mills, I would prefer that the medication come in the form of a pelleted product. Maybe it's mixed in already into a supplement or concentrate pellet. That's my preference, only because I feel like it gets mixed more efficiently. We're talking mixing something the size of a grain of rice into a 5-gallon bucket full of feed. Sure. Okay. So making sure that that gets mixed efficiently is the key.
Sure.
And so that's why I like to leave it up to the professionals on that kind of thing. And instead of mixing that stuff on farm, I do not recommend mixing any of the Coccidiostats on farm.
Sure.
So rumensin 90, I think that's the right term. That's like a very concentrated.
That's the most concentrated form of rumensin that you will find, and you typically will not be able to purchase that.
I learned the hard way with that quite a few years back. Had an outfit mixing feed for me, and anyway, long story short, we lost like 30 head probably till we caught on to what was going on.
That is unfortunate. I will say, though, it's not uncommon. That does happen, when we try to mix things on farm because it sounds easier or it sounds cheaper. But an example would be in a grower diet for goats. It depends on the feeding rate, but I may only need less than a half a pound, maybe less than a quarter of a pound of rumensin 90 in an entire 1-ton batch of 2,000 pounds of feed. So getting that mixed efficiently and making sure that every animal gets it versus, one animal getting all of it in one bite, that's the challenge. And that's why I say we leave it up to the feed manufacturers to help us with that. And I won't give you any numbers today. And that's because honestly, it's so variable depending on feeding rate and weights of the animal. So that's where it's very important that we look at our feed tags. And that's one of my jobs as a nutritionist, is to do that math and calculate the milligrams per head per day or grams per head per day, not just grams per ton of feed, because it varies depending on what our feeding rate is too.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Leon, in your situation there, what was happening? The feed mill wasn't getting it mixed correctly?
It was, yeah, there was a mistake and they mixed it 7 to 12 times too strong.
Oh,
And
wow.
the interesting thing is Rumensin's very bitter. Well, you already mentioned that, Barbie. It doesn't taste good. And the animals actually went off feed. Well, not off feed, but they didn't want to eat right.
Yeah.
And anyway.
So that was your first red flag.
We didn't pick on it though. It was like a couple days later that when the sheep started dying, that we started putting the pieces together.
Maybe they were trying.
And
to
I had to go back.
Yeah.
Yeah, they sure were. I had to go back to the nutritionalist the second time and say, now, what were those numbers again? And then we started running the numbers, and he's like, oh. And right then and there, I'm like, well, there's the problem. So anyway.
So those are the situations that make a good thing look bad. Because we did a little math wrong. And honestly, it's a matter of moving a decimal point, 2 pounds versus 0.2 pounds in a ton batch.
Right.
And
so we all make those errors. Certainly that's why feed companies have insurance.
Sure. Is there, you already said you don't feel like they build up resistance to these different Coccidiostats. Would it still be a good management practice to every couple years switch out to a different one, or really no need for that?
That's a personal preference, Matt. Some farms do just fine with using the same product for years on end. I think it depends on your situation. Are you in a feedlot situation where you never have the same animals? Or are you in a situation where maybe you have the same set of ewes and you're selling all your lambs? It depends on a lot of things. But again, what works in one region doesn't always work for another region of the country. Some of that is really climate based, and the stage that it targets. Resistance build up at this point. So for me, I don't know that it's worth changing things up. However, I don't think it's a bad idea if you want to do that every few years, if your finances will allow that, because like I said, Decox is a good bit more expensive than Rumensin or Bobatech.
Okay.
So if we have producers that aren't feeding any grain, what are some options for them to get a Coccidiostat into those ewes or does?
Yeah. So first off, we need to focus on management, right? And make sure that we're not having really wet areas and wet bedded areas, whether you're in your barn or outside. But outside of that, I would say there are some products out there on the market. I know of one made by Premier One that it is a Decox mixing agent, basically, that you mix with salt. I know Matt uses that occasionally, and it's a good way to get the Coccidiostat into them without a feed. However, I will say I don't prefer that just because you have an inconsistent consumption rate. So if they aren't consuming the salt or mineral that you're adding it to per the instructions on the bag, then they're not getting consistent control of the coccidia either. And data has shown that loose minerals, free choice minerals, do not get consistent consumption on a daily basis. And so that's why I'm very hesitant to even use it. It's certainly better than nothing, but it's not going to control an outbreak, same as using it in the feed. Now, Matt uses it in a little different way. He mixes it and then adds it into his TMR that way. That's a good way to mix it on farm. That's really the only way I would suggest mixing it on the farm versus at a manufacturer.
So he's mixing it into his mineral mix, which gets added at a certain rate.
Yes.
To his TMR. Yes. So that gets a pretty uniform distribution of the product and pretty uniform consumption that way.
Correct.
Yeah. So just to clarify one thing, you mentioned that research shows that mineral consumption is not consistent. You're not suggesting that loose mineral is a bad way to get a mineral into the sheep or goats. It's just a bad way to get a consistent supply of a coccidiostat into the animal. Am I right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
It's just some days they eat more than others. And with that coccidiostat has to be in there at the proper level on a regular basis to get coverage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. So I guess that would give the ewes some coverage, and then maybe those producers that aren't feeding grain, maybe they are feeding a creep feed, and then the creep feed could pick up the slack once those lambs are
yes, grain. That would be the ideal situation.
It would not work very well to expect to get coverage in lambs just putting it through the mineral.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I can hardly see how you'd have to have a pretty high inclusion rate for one thing to make it. It just wouldn't be a very good scenario. So yeah, very good. So kind of just to wrap it up and recap, Barbie, I was curious, do you have like 2 or 3 things that we as farmers can do to mitigate risk?
So mitigating risk for coccidiosis, I would say, first off, make sure your pens are clean. They don't get too wet, and you're cleaning out your barns regularly. By that, I mean at least once to twice a year, depending on your management situation. Some of your situations in a feedlot, it may mean cleaning out once a week. So that's a management practice that I would look at. The other thing is, I like to have a coccidiostat in the feed, at least for lambs and kids from creep up to your grower feed till they're about 6 months old. Certainly, if you're going to treat, contact your vet and make sure you have the right program for coccidiosis treatment. If you start seeing scours, get a fecal sample done. Don't just try and guess and treat. I think that's important. But last but not least, consult your nutritionist with help with any of these coccidiostats and helping you find which one's right for your program.
And if you need a nutritionist, Barbie will be glad to help you out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Feel free to go to my website, smallruminantconsulting.com, or you can contact me directly. My phone number is 513-205-7992, and I'd be happy to help you out.
Hey, thanks again, Barbie, for coming on and discussing coccidiostats and how to use them with us. I think this is something our listeners will find useful. I would also like to just remind you that this call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale. We are your universal feeder distributor, as well as a Marwell sheep and goat handling equipment distributor. So if you're in the market for sheep and goat handling equipment, hay racks, fence line feeders, saliva lick feeders, we've got options for you. Feel free to reach out to us or one of our dealers and we will try to help you out. With breeding season just around the corner, if you're looking for an option to flush feed those ewes or does on pasture, check out Universal Feeder's Saliva Lick Feeder. A universal feeder gives you the ability to restrict an animal's intake to a predetermined amount. So once again, this is the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch up with you next time.